Chapter 9 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Chapter 9, containing further particulars concerning the pleasant old gentleman and his hopeful pupils. It was late next morning when Oliver awoke from a sound, long sleep. There was no other person in the room but the old Jew, who was boiling some coffee in a saucepan for breakfast, and whistling softly to himself as he stirred it round and round with an iron spoon. He would stop every now and then to listen when there was the least noise below, and when he had satisfied himself he would go on whistling and stirring again as before. Although Oliver had roused himself from sleep, he was not thoroughly awake. There is a drowsy state between sleeping and waking, when you dream more in 5 minutes with your eyes half open and yourself half conscious of everything that is passing around you than you would in 5 nights without your eyes fast closed and your senses wrapped in perfect unconsciousness. At such time a mortal knows just enough of what his mind is doing, forms some glimmering conception of its mighty powers, its bounding from earth and spurning time and space when freed from the restraint of its corporeal associate. Oliver was precisely in this condition. He saw the Jew with his half-closed eyes, heard the low whistling and recognised the sound of the spoon grating against the saucepan's sides. And yet the same senses were mentally engaged at the same time in busy action with almost everybody he had ever known. When the coffee was done, the Jew drew the saucepan to the hob. Standing then in an irresolute attitude for a few minutes, as if he did not well know how to employ himself, he turned round and looked at Oliver and called him by his name. He did not answer, and was to all appearances asleep. After satisfying himself upon this head, the Jew stepped gently to the door, which he unfastened. He then drew forth, as it seemed to Oliver, from some trap in the floor, a small box which he placed carefully on the table. His eyes glistened as he raised the lid and looked in. Dragging an old chair to the table, he sat down and took from it a magnificent gold watch, sparkling with jewels. "Aha," said the Jew, shrugging up his shoulders and distorting every feature with a hideous grin. Clever dogs, staunch to the last. Never told the old parson where they were. Never poached upon old Fagin. And why should they? He wouldn't have loosened the knot or kept the drop up a minute longer. No. Fine fellows, fine fellows." With these and other muttered reflections of the like nature, the Jew once more deposited the watch in its place of safety. At least half a dozen more were severally drawn forth from the same box and surveyed with equal pleasure, besides rings, brooches, bracelets, and other articles of jewellery of such magnificent materials and costly workmanship that Oliver had no idea even of their names. Having replaced these trinkets, the Jew took out another so small that it lay in the palm of his hand. There seemed to be some very minute inscription on it, for the Jew laid it flat upon the table, and shading it with his hand, pored over it long and earnestly. At length he put it down, as if despairing of success, and leaning back in his chair, muttered, "What a fine thing capital punishment is! Dead men never repent. Dead men never bring awkward stories to light. It's a fine thing for the trade. 5 of 'em strung up in a row, and none left to play booty or turn white-livered." As the Jew uttered these words, his bright dark eyes, which had been staring vacantly before him, fell on Oliver's face. The boy's eyes were fixed on his in mute curiosity, and although the recognition was only for an instant, for the briefest space of time that can possibly be conceived, it was enough to show the old man that he had been observed. He closed the lid of a box with a loud crash, and laying his hand on a bread knife which was on the table, started furiously up. He trembled very much though, for even in his terror Oliver could see that the knife quivered in the air. "What's that?" said the Jew. "What do you watch me for? Why are you awake? What have you seen? Speak out, boy. Quick for your life." "I wasn't able to sleep any longer, sir," replied Oliver meekly. "I'm very sorry if I've disturbed you, sir." "You were not awake an hour ago?" said the Jew, scowling fiercely on the boy. No, indeed," replied Oliver. "Are you sure?" cried the Jew. with a still fiercer look than before and a threatening attitude. "Upon my word, I was not, sir," replied Oliver earnestly. "I was not indeed, sir." "Tush, tush, my dear," said the Jew, abruptly resuming his old manner and playing with the knife a little before he laid it down, as if to induce the belief that he had caught it up in mere sport. "Of course I know that, my dear. I only tried to frighten you. You're a brave boy, Oliver." The Jew rubbed his hands with a chuckle, but glanced uneasily at the box notwithstanding. "Do you see any of these pretty things, my dear?" said the Jew, laying his hand upon it after a short pause. "Yes, sir," replied Oliver. "Ah," said the Jew, turning rather pale. They're mine, Oliver, my little property, all I have to live upon in my old age. The folks call me miser, my dear, only a miser, that's all." Oliver thought the old gentleman must be a decided miser to live in such a dirty place with so many watches, but thinking that perhaps his fondness for the Dodger and the other boys cost him a good deal of money, he only cast a deferential look at the Jew and asked if he might get up. "Certainly, my dear, certainly," replied the old gentleman. "Stay, there's a pitcher of water in the corner by the door. Bring it here and I'll give you a basin to wash in, my dear." Oliver got up, walked across the room, stooped for an instant to raise the pitcher. When he turned his head, the box was gone. He had scarcely washed himself and made everything tidy by emptying the basin out of the window, agreeably to the Jew's directions, when the Dodger returned, accompanied by a very sprightly young friend who Oliver had seen smoking on the previous night, and who was now formally introduced to him as Charlie Bates. The four sat down to breakfast on the coffee, and some on hot rolls and ham which the Dodger had brought home in the crown of his hat. "Well," said the Jew, glancing slyly at Oliver and addressing himself to the Dodger, "I hope you've been at work this morning, my dears." "Hard," replied the Dodger. "As nails," added Charlie Bates. Good boys," said the Jew. "What have you got, Dodger?" "A couple of pocket books," replied the young gentleman. "Lined?" inquired the Jew with eagerness. "Pretty well," replied the Dodger, producing two pocket books, one green and the other red. "Very indeed, sir," said Oliver, at which Mr. Charles Bates laughed uproariously, very much to the amazement of Oliver, who saw nothing to laugh at in anything that had passed. "And what have you got, my dears?" said Fagin to Charlie Bates, replied Master Bates, at the same time producing four pocket handkerchiefs. "Well," said the Jew, inspecting them closely, "they're very good ones, very. You haven't marked them well, though, Charlie, so the marks shall be picked out with a needle, and we'll teach Oliver how to do it. Shall us, Oliver? Hey, ha, ha!" "If you please, sir," said Oliver. "You'd like to be able to make pocket handkerchiefs as easy as Charlie Bates, wouldn't you, my dear?" said the Jew. "Very much indeed, if you'll teach me, sir," replied Oliver. Master Bates saw something so exquisitely ludicrous in this reply that he burst into another laugh, which laugh, meeting the coffee he was drinking and carrying it down some long channel, very nearly terminated in his premature suffocation. "He's so jolly green," said Charlie when he recovered, as an apology to the company for his unpolite behaviour. The Dodger said nothing, but he smoothed Oliver's hair over his eyes and said he'd know better by and by, upon which the old gentleman, observing Oliver's colour mounting, changed the subject by asking whether there had been much of a crowd at the execution that morning. This made him wonder more and more, for it was plain from the replies of the two boys that they had both been there, and Oliver naturally wondered how they could possibly have found time to be so very industrious. When the breakfast was cleared away, the merry old gentleman and the two boys played at a very curious and uncommon game, which was performed in this way. The merry old gentleman, placing a snuff box in one pocket of his trousers and a note case in the other, and a watch in his waistcoat pocket, with a guard chain round his neck, and sticking a mock diamond pin in his shirt, buttoned his coat tight round him, and putting his spectacle case and handkerchief into his pockets, trotted up and down the room with a stick, in imitation of the manner in which old gentlemen walk about the streets at any hour in the day. Sometimes he stopped at the fireplace, and sometimes at the door, making believe he was staring with all his might into shop windows. At such times he would look constantly round him for fear of thieves, and would keep slapping all his pockets in turn to see that he hadn't lost anything, in such a very funny and natural manner that Oliver laughed till the tears ran down his face. All this time the two boys followed him closely about, getting out of his sight, so nimbly that every time he turned round it was impossible to follow their motions. At last the dodger trod upon his toes or ran upon his boot accidentally, while Charlie Bates stumbled up against him behind, and in that one moment they took from him, with the most extraordinary rapidity, snuff box, note case, watch guard, chain, shirt pin, pocket handkerchief, and even the spectacle case. If the old gentleman felt a hand in any one of his pockets, he cried out where it was, and then the game began all over again. When this game had been played a great many times, a couple of young ladies called to see the young gentleman, one of whom was named Bet, and the other Nancy. They wore a good deal of hair, not very neatly turned up behind, and were rather untidy about shoes and stockings. They were not exactly pretty, perhaps, but they had a great deal of colour in their face, and looked quite stout and hearty. Being remarkably free and agreeable in their manners, Oliver thought them very nice girls indeed, and there is no doubt they were. The visitors stopped a long time. Spirits were produced in consequence of one of the young ladies complaining of a coldness in her inside, and the conversation took a very convivial and improving turn. At length Charlie Bates expressed his opinion that it was time to pad the hoof. This, it occurred to Oliver, must be French for going out, for directly afterwards the Dodger and Charlie and the two young ladies went away together, having been kindly furnished by the amiable old Jew with money to spend. "There, my dear," said Fagin, "that's a pleasant life, isn't it? They have gone out for the day." "Have they done work, sir?" inquired Oliver. "Yes," said the Jew, "that is, unless they should unexpectedly come across any when they're out, and they won't neglect it. If they do, my dear, depend upon it, make 'em your models, my dear, make 'em your models," tapping the fire shovel on the hearth to add force to his words. "Do everything they bid you, and take their advice in all matters. Especially the Dodgers, my dear, will be a great man himself, and will make you one too. If you take pattern by him, is my handkerchief hanging out of my pocket, my dear?" said the Jew, stopping short. "Yes, sir," said Oliver. "See if you can take it out without my feeling it, as you saw them do when we were at play this morning." Oliver held up the bottom pocket with one hand, as he had seen the Dodger do, and drew the handkerchief lightly out of it with the other. "Is it gone?" cried the Jew. "Here it is, sir," said Oliver, showing it in his hand. "You're a clever boy, my dear," said the playful old gentleman, patting Oliver on the head approvingly. "I never saw a sharper lad. Here's a shilling for you. If you go on in this way you'll be the greatest man of the time. And now come here and I'll show you how to take the marks out of the handkerchiefs." Oliver wondered what picking the old man's pocket in play had to do with his chances of being a great man, but thinking that the Jew, was being so much his senior, must know best, he followed him quietly to the table and was soon deeply involved in his new study. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Oliver becomes better acquainted with the characters of his new associates and purchases experience at a high price, being a short but very important chapter in this history. For many days Oliver remained in the Jew's room, picking the marks out of the pocket handkerchief, of which a great number were brought home, and sometimes taking part in the game already described, which the two boys and the Jew played regularly every morning. At length he began to languish for fresh air, took many occasions of earnestly entreating the old gentleman to allow him to go out to work with his two companions. Oliver was rendered the more anxious to be actively employed by what he had seen of the stern morality of the old gentleman's character. Whenever the Dodger or Charlie Bates came home at night empty-handed, he would expatiate with great vehemence on the misery of idle and lazy habits, and would enforce upon them the necessity of an active life by sending them supperless to bed. On one occasion, indeed, he even went so far as to knock them both down a flight of stairs, but this was carrying out his virtuous precepts to an unusual extent. At length one morning Oliver obtained permission he had so eagerly sought. There had been no handkerchiefs to work upon for 2 or 3 days, and the dinners had been rather meagre. Perhaps these were the reasons for the old gentleman's giving his assent, but whether they were or no, he told Oliver he might go, and placed him under the joint guardianship Charlie Bates and his friend the Dodger. The three boys sallied out, the Dodger with his coat sleeves tucked up and his hat cocked as usual, Master Bates sauntering alongside with his hands in his pockets, and Oliver between them, wondering where they were going and what branch of manufacture he would be instructed in first. The pace at which they went was such a very lazy, ill-looking saunter that Oliver soon began to think his companions were going to deceive the old gentleman by not going to work at all. The Dodger had a vicious propensity to pulling the caps off the heads of small boys and tossing them down areas, while Charlie Bates exhibited some very loose notions concerning the rights of property by pilfering divers apples and onions from the stalls at the kennel sides, and thrusting them into his pockets, which were so surprisingly capacious that they seemed to undermine his whole suit of clothes in every direction. These things looked so bad that Oliver was on the point of declaring his intention of seeking his way back in the best way he could, when his thoughts were suddenly directed into another channel by a very mysterious change of behaviour on the part of the Dodger. They were just emerging from a narrow court, not far from the open square in Clerkenwell, which is yet called, by some strange perversion of terms, the Green, when the Dodger made a sudden stop, and laying his finger on his lip, drew his companions back again, and with the greatest of caution and circumspection. "What's the matter?" demanded Oliver. "Hush," replied the Dodger. "Do you see that old cove over at the bookstall?" "The old gentleman over the way," said Oliver. "Yes, I see him." "He'll do," said the Dodger. "A prime plant," observed Master Charlie Bates. Oliver looked from one to the other with the greatest surprise, but he was not permitted to make any inquiries, for the two boys walked stealthily across the road and slunk close behind the old gentleman towards whom his attention had been directed. Oliver walked a few paces after them, and not knowing whither to advance or retire, stood looking on in silent amazement. The old gentleman was a very respectable looking personage, with a powdered head and gold spectacles. He was dressed in a bottle green coat with a black velvet collar, wore white trousers, and carried a smart bamboo cane under his arm. He had taken up a book from the stall, and there he stood, reading away as hard as if he were in his elbow chair in his own study. It is very possible that he fancied himself there, indeed, for it was plain from his abstraction that he saw not the bookstall, nor the street, nor the boys, nor, in short, anything but the book itself, which he was reading straight through, turning over the leaf, and when he got to the bottom of a page, beginning at the top of the next one, and going regularly on with the greatest interest and eagerness. What was Oliver's horror and alarm as he stood a few paces off, looking on with his eyelids as wide open as they could possibly go, to see the Dodger plunge his hand into the old gentleman's pocket and draw from thence a handkerchief, to see him hand the same to Charlie Bates, and finally to behold them both running away round the corner at full speed. In an instant the whole mystery of the handkerchiefs and the watches and the jewels and the Jew rushed upon the boy's mind. He stood for a moment with the blood so tingling through his veins from terror that he felt as if he were in a burning fire. Then, confused and frightened, he took to his heels, and not knowing what he did, made off as fast as he could lay his feet to the ground. This was all done in a minute's space. In the very instant when Oliver began to run, the old gentleman, putting his hand into his pocket and missing his handkerchief, turned sharp round. Seeing the boy scudding away at such a rapid pace, he very naturally concluded him to be the depredator, and shouting "Stop thief!" with all his might, made off after him, book in hand. But the old gentleman was not the only person who raised the hue and cry. The Dodger and Master Bates, unwilling to attract public attention by running down the open street, had merely retired into the very first doorway round the corner. They no sooner heard the cry and saw Oliver running, than, guessing exactly how the matter stood, they issued forth with great promptitude, and shouting "Stop thief!" too, joined in the pursuit like good citizens. Although Oliver had been brought up by philosophers, he was not theoretically acquainted with the beautiful axiom that self-preservation is the first law of nature. If he had been, perhaps he would have been prepared for this. Not being prepared, however, It alarmed him the more, so away he went like the wind, with the old gentleman and the two boys roaring and shouting behind him. Stop thief! Stop thief! There is a magic in the sound. Tradesman leaves his counter, carman his wagon, the butcher throws down his tray, the baker his basket, the milkman his pail, the errand boy his parcels, the schoolboy his marbles, the paver his pickaxe, the child his battledore. Away they run, pell-mell, helter-skelter, slapdash, tearing, yelling, screaming, knocking down the passages as they turn the corners, rousing up the dogs and astonishing the fowls, and street squares and courts re-echo with the sound. Stop thief! Stop thief! The cry is taken up by 100 voices, and the crowd accumulate at every turning. Away they fly, splashing through the mud and rattling along the pavements. Up go the windows, outrun the people, onward bear the mob. A whole audience desert Punch in the very thickest of the plot, and joining the rushing throng, swell the shout and lead fresh vigour to the cry, "Stop thief! Stop thief!" Stop thief! Stop thief! There is a passion for hunting something deeply implanted in the human breast. One wretched, breathless child, panting with exhaustion, terror in his looks, agony in his eyes, large drops of perspiration streaming down his face, strains every nerve to make a head upon his pursuers, and as they follow on his track and gain upon him every instant, they hail his decreasing strength with joy. Stop thief! Aye, stop him for God's sake, were it only in mercy. Stopped at last, a clever blow. He is down upon the pavement, and the crowd eagerly gather round him, each newcomer jostling and struggling with the others to catch a glimpse. Stand aside, give him a little air. Nonsense, he don't deserve it. Where's the gentleman? Here he is, coming down the street. Make room there for the gentleman. Is this the boy, sir? Yes. Oliver lay covered with mud and dust and bleeding from the mouth, looking wildly round upon the heap of faces that surrounded him. When the old gentleman was viciously dragged and pushed into the circle by the foremost of the pursuers. Yes, said the gentleman, I'm afraid it is the boy. Poor fellow, said the gentleman, has he hurt himself? I did that, sir, said a great lubberly fellow, stepping forward, and preciously I cut my knuckle again his mouth and stopped him, sir. The fellow touched his hat with a grin, expecting something for his pains, but the old gentleman, eyeing him with an expression of dislike, looked anxiously around as if he contemplated running away himself, which it is very possible he might have attempted to do, and thus have afforded another chase had not a police officer, who is generally the last person to arrive in such cases, at that moment made his way through the crowd and seized Oliver by the collar. Come, get up, said the man roughly. It wasn't me, indeed, sir, indeed. It was two other boys, said Oliver, clasping his hands passionately and looking round. They're here somewhere. Oh, no, they ain't, said the officer. He meant this to be ironical, but it was true besides, for the Dodger and Charlie Bates had filed off down the first convenient court they came to. Come, get up. Don't hurt him, said the old gentleman passionately. Oh, I won't hurt him, replied the officer, tearing his jacket half off his back in proof thereof. Come, I know you. It won't do. Will you stand on your legs, you young devil? Oliver, who could hardly stand, made a shift to raise himself on his feet, and was at once lugged along the streets by the jacket collar at a rapid pace. The gentleman walked with them by the officer's side, and as many of the crowd as could achieve the feat got a little ahead and stared back at Oliver from time to time. The boys shouted in triumph, and on they went. End of chapter 10.